Okay, it is officially noon my time, Central, and I guess that means it's 1 Eastern. So we're going to go ahead and get started today. So thank you again for joining our webinar, Practical Steps for Effective Program Evaluation. My name is Joe Sanchez, and I am the Grants and Development Manager for the National Council on Problem Gambling. So just a quick reminder, for those of you who haven't joined us in a while about NCPG, our vision is to advance well-being by minimizing harm from gambling problems. Our mission is to lead awareness and advocacy efforts to reduce gambling harm. Did want to note that NCPG does take a neutral stance on legalized gambling, meaning we are not for or against legalized gambling, but we do advocate to mitigate gambling related harm. Wanted to alert you of some other upcoming webinars. If you are interested in joining any of those as well, you can go to ncpgambling.org/webinars. We have one coming up on our Agility Grants Fall 2026 session. That grant program will be opening up in July for applications. And then we have another one coming up, Campus Plus Community Partnering for Impact in Gambling Harm and Prevention on August 25th. So please sign up for those if you are interested. Also upcoming is our 2026 annual conference, which we are very excited about. It is just around the corner. It is going to be in Nashville this year, July 22nd through 24th at the Renaissance Nashville Hotel. I guarantee it's going to be a great time. So if you are able to, please join us. And if you're there, please come say hi to me. Okay, today's presenter is Matthew Courser, PhD. Dr. Matthew Courser has worked in the field of evaluation research since 2003 and specializes in designing and implementing high quality evaluations. He also works to support the health and well-being of individuals and communities with a focus on substance use and gambling prevention. We're very happy to have Dr. Courser join us today for this webinar, and I will happily turn it over to him. So, Dr. Courser, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll allow you to share yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being part of this webinar today. In a second, I'm going to go ahead and share some slides. But as we're getting started, I'd love to get to know you more. So if you could put your name, your organization in the chat, and whether you feel like you are new to evaluation or experienced with it, that'll help us as we go through our webinar today. Uh, Today, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to talk through a really wide variety of things related to evaluation. And what's important about this is that we're going to talk about the context that we're in. We're going to talk about logic models and how they can guide programs that you're developing. And we're going to talk through some of the key steps in designing and implementing an evaluation. For some of you, you may come to this with decades of experience, and some of you may be new. So one of the things we hope as we go through is that as you have questions, to put them in the chat. I'll try to answer those in real time. And if we can't get those answered during the webinar, we'll certainly follow up afterwards. Also, the hope is that we're going to get through our slides, but we'll get as far as we can because I definitely do want to leave time at the end for us to have some Q&A. I always like to start a presentation with a bit of a roadmap so that we have a shared framework as we move forward. Today, we're going to work on covering about 7 different things. Really, the context of gambling and some public health impacts. We're going to talk a lot about why it's important to evaluate, and the why that we have when we're looking at program development and evaluation is really important because it really does give us that motivation for the work. We're going to talk about logic models for both program design and evaluation design. We're going to step through a process for evaluation, knowing that your process may be different, your context may be different, and that's okay. We'll talk through some measurement considerations and talk through some resources to support evaluation. This slide deck will come out after this so that you'll have that to guide your work as well. I think these three questions are kind of the big why for us. We're in a context right now where the prevalence of gambling and new forms of gambling are increasing. Our need to make a difference, is increasing as well. Our need to support our communities is increasing. And so I think these three questions, as we think about evaluation, and then also, think about how we're designing programs and thinking about our next steps as organizations become really important. How do we know what we're doing is making a difference? Are we moving the needle the way we need to? And, how do we tell our funders and our stakeholders really a compelling story? All of this is happening, I think, in one of the more challenging contexts that we've seen. We just talked about the fact that we have the prevalence of gambling and new forms of gambling. We have technological disruption. We're seeing that apps and online efforts and new forms and prediction markets and all those things that we're hearing about in the media are coming up. And we're starting to see more and more public health impacts. It doesn't take long to do a search and find lots of different aspects to the context that we're in. Everything from trading volumes to concerns about public health and suicide ideation, to revenue hitting records. And also things like parlay bets. We're seeing a lot of those. So this is all new. It's moving in some respects faster than we can. So as professionals, who are concerned about our communities and our systems need to move forward. This is all something that we need to keep in mind. Evaluation may seem daunting. It may seem like something only specially trained people can do. And this quote is from one of my favorite books as I've looked at working with communities called Walk Out and Walk In. Um, the idea of starting anywhere and following it everywhere. And this is something we can apply whether we're new to this or whether we've done it for decades. We need simply to choose a place to start. And then from there, we can follow those threads and we can learn and we can grow. And so really that's the orientation I'm going to bring to our hour together is the idea that we can all do this. We all have something to learn. And as we work together as a community, we can really understand more about sort of what we're doing and then how it makes a difference. We've touched on some of these, but these are probably some of the five most common reasons we may need to evaluate. The biggest one is sometimes it's required. We have to do it. But as we're working, we also may want to know if our programs and strategies are working the way we want them to, or if there are ways we can improve them. We want to improve our communities. We want to be able to talk about what we're doing and why it made a difference. And one of the things when it comes to problem gambling is that historically there's been less funding for interventions, strategies, campaigns to reduce those harms. And so as we know more about what we're doing, what those impacts are, it really does support new grant applications, new funding applications. It helps us sustain and grow our efforts. We're going to start today with logic models. And what a logic model is really just a visual map of your program. And it's going to help connect your program components together to create really a shared understanding of the program. And with that, it's also going to connect to what you're doing, those activities, the outputs, how much of things you're doing, how many trainings, how many aspects of the media campaign, how long it runs, those sorts of things, to outcomes. And then that overall impact in our community, sort of that longer term type of impact. One of the things that becomes important about a logic model is the tighter that model is, the better and easier it is to communicate about what you're doing. And the better and easier it is to actually figure out how to evaluate what you're doing. A logic model in its really most simple form is a logic chain. It's going to talk about like if we do this, then this will change. And that's a really powerful thing when we're talking to our funders, and when we're talking about how what we're doing makes a difference. I always think sometimes that creating a logic model for our program and to guide evaluation can seem like it's a big challenge. So much of the time when we see these, we see large boxes, lots of little boxes, um, and I like to start for that reason, really with this with a pretty simple example. When we're thinking about designing something to impact any aspect of problem gambling, we've got some inputs. We have funding, we'll have staff resources, our human capital. We might have a program. We might have an intervention strategy or something like that. And sometimes it's a policy. Those are all things that we're bringing to the table to see how it improves the conditions in our communities. Then in a logic model, we have outputs, and that's what we do. We delivered 10 sessions of a training curriculum. We ran a media campaign in 7 communities for 8 months. Um, and those outputs also talk about who we reached. And then we also have our outcomes. And in general, we can have some short-term ones. And that oftentimes that's awareness, that might be knowledge. We can have some medium-term outcomes, which are attitudes and behaviors. And we are likely to have, if we keep up with it and we're able to really build out a program with funding and different program components, we can change the fabric of our environment, of our context, of our communities, so that things like prevention efforts related to problem gambling are institutionalized in our community. We're going to shift now and talk about NCPG's logic model template. And this is something that it was adapted by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And we've linked to it at the end of the slides. But one of the reasons I want to talk through this is that it's a really good way to plan your program and a good way to plan your evaluation. It has across the top inputs and resources, the things you're given, the activities, what you're doing, the outputs, sort of how much you're doing, who you're going to impact, sort of the short-term outcomes, how you're going to measure those. It's going to have also behavioral action, which kind of corresponds to those medium-term things, probably like our risk and protective factors, maybe some behavior change, and then sort of those long-term impacts at our community, how we change that fabric. Actually, I'm going to go back. And this is that same logic model, just again, that bigger table to help us talk it through. Um, the first part about this is our inputs and resources, and that's really what you need to implement the activities you proposed. And it's going to be things like the time, the staff, the funding, the technical assistance, and the partnerships. Your activities and really what you're going to do. And really in a good logic model, you can do this as a set of bullet points. Just start listing it out. Your outputs are things like the number of participants, the number of activities, the number of products you create, the types of services you provide, um, or the number of deliverables. In your participants or audience, that's really kind of your priority population. You can think about 2 populations, the people you are generally engaging with and those who are being engaged with secondarily. If we're working with students in a high school, they would be our direct population, but their families might be our secondary or our passive population, because hopefully those students are taking things back to the family and talking about what they're learning. Our short-term outcomes, the immediate changes, attitudes, awareness, and knowledge. Could also be community engagement in the project as well. So we move across that template. We've got our evaluation methods. Like, how we're going to do this. How are we going to measure our outcomes? It might be that we're going to do a survey, pre and post tests, some focus groups. We might do activity logs. We might look at media reach. We might look at record data. We also may look at some data from our partners, like if we're working with college students that they have. Those are all the ways that we might be able to measure those short-term outcomes. Our behavioral action or sort of midterm outcome. And I know that the top part of this says beyond the grant period. That really sort of supposes that it's a short grant. Um, if you've got funding for 2 or 3 years, it's probably within the grant period. But those impacts might be, you know, folks reporting that they're accessing and sharing resources. They're avoiding high-risk situations. That they feel that gambling is more harmful than they did. That their peers and their friends are gambling less, or that they perceive it as more risky. These are all things that you might be able to, if you're doing a program, and you're not sure what those sort of medium-term outcomes can be, it might be in the program materials. It's also something that you can look at what other people have done that's similar, and that's a great guide to help identifying what those midterm outcomes might be. And then our impacts. These are, down the road. If we keep doing what we're doing, um, if we are able to build out a program, not just a single grant or something like that, how do we want our community to change? To some extent, this can be an aspirational vision, but it's really sort of what you want to work towards. A community that has healthier norms around gambling, a community that has more comprehensive prevention systems, um, folks that have, you know, that really have the tools to make safer or more responsible decisions. There's a couple of things with logic models I think just to highlight. The first is that you can use a variety of formats, and if you do a Google search, there are many, many different types of logic model formats. In general, what's important is that you have one to guide your program and to guide those conversations with your stakeholders and funders. Your logic model really just needs to meet the needs of your audiences, and you probably have at least four. It might be your funder. Um, if you're applying for funding, it could be the folks who are reviewing the applications. It can be your agency and team because they can use that to help develop components. They can use the logic model to help develop the work plan. And your stakeholders, it guides what that conversation with them can look like. We've talked a little bit about the logic chain. The best part about this is that it gives you a sense of if this happens, then we can expect this to happen. And if this happens, we can expect to have this happen. Um, that logic chain is really powerful as a communication tool. I want to talk just a second about like tips and tricks for creating or refining a logic model. They take time to create. You can start early if you're in the middle of a grant process and integrate it into that application period. Um, if you are building out a program without a grant application, it's just know that it's going to take time and you're going to iterate that. Um, you know, what I like to do when I'm making a logic model is I'll add some content and then usually I'll step away and come back to it and review. I'll have my team take a look. I'll have stakeholders take a look. I like to read out loud what's in a logic model to a colleague or to my team because as I'm reading it, it becomes really clear if I've got the logic, in place, if I have missed some things or something like that. Um, it may seem like this is a big lift, but I love the idea that we can chunk it down into small steps and we can get to a great place. And I think the final thing I would say about a logic model is I have never written a logic model that I haven't come back to in 3 months and wonder without I come back to it and then I'm always sure that there's a bunch of other things I could have put in there or lots of different changes. And that's not a problem at all. I think that just shows that we in this field are growing, that we have more knowledge because we've been working on the program. We have more experience. We have more ideas, a fresh mind. So when you do a logic model, just know it will likely be a living document. And if you come back to it in a couple of months and you're not sure why you ever thought it was finished, it doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It just means that you're growing. We're going to shift gears. And as we go through this, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll stop and talk through them, and then we'll make sure too that we've got time at the end to really work through those questions as well. Um, for this webinar, what we've put together is a step-by-step process for evaluation. Um, what I want you to know is that your process might look a little bit different. Um, in some cases, evaluation might be linear. You might be able to step through it like this. In other times, it may feel like you're in kind of a circle, and you're doing lots of things, or maybe you're doing two or three parts of this at the same time, and none of that's wrong. What's important is that just know that you can build out a process, you can step through it systematically, um, and if you have additional steps or some steps don't apply, that's fine too. In general, we're going to talk about, and we'll go into detail, like your first thing to do is to decide what to evaluate. That's the what. You'll form a team. Who's going to do the evaluation? You'll decide on that type of evaluation and what kind of design you want to use. And that's kind of getting to the how, along with measuring outcomes and collecting data. You'll work through analyzing, reporting, and sharing that data and your results. And finally, at the end, I want to make sure that we consider storytelling as an evaluation tool and as a component. That first step of deciding what to evaluate. Here we've got a guiding question of like, what do you need to know and from whom or what? All of that makes sense, but I think there's even a more basic question here of if you have an effort designed to impact something related to problem gambling, figuring out what part of that or all of it you're going to evaluate. Your logic model can really help you identify that. It can help you identify what sort of outcomes you want to design measurement for. It can help you determine whether you also want to get some feedback. Um, if you're doing a media campaign for a lottery, if you want to actually try to reach people who have engaged with the campaign and understand more about their experiences with the message or how it's changed their behavior. Those are all things that you can build in. And we talked just a little bit about this. The scope. Are you going to evaluate the entire program or initiative or just parts of it? And that can be some part of the toughest thing to work through. It's one of the toughest things to work through at this stage. Our instinct as professionals and as people working in the field who want to make a difference is we want to make sure that we evaluate everything. But the reality is that we may not be able to do that to start. We have to pick a starting point, and then we can follow those threads wherever they lead us. And so things to think about is the capacity. If you have a small team and limited resources, it may be that most of your capacity is going to go towards actually implementing the program, and you'll have limited capacity to evaluate it. And that's okay. You can then look at options to scale that evaluation up in the future. You might have limited resources. Our problem gambling prevention and other efforts tend not to have as much funding associated with them. That's starting to change, but it's not there yet. So think about a springboard approach where you start somewhere, you follow it, you look in the future to build more pieces into that. As you think about an evaluation, you need to also think about forming your evaluation team. And this also is going to interact with your capacities, the size of your team, and the resources that you have. So much of the time in the work I do, I might be designing an initiative, and I might also be evaluating it at the same time, or developing that evaluation. If you're in a large organization, you might have the benefit of having staff that have measurement, evaluation, or performance management experience. And that might let you focus on designing the program or the initiative while they actually lead the evaluation part. Um, Depending on your resources, you may also be able to include staff from outside your organization, specialized evaluation firms, consultants, staff from things like United Way, college or university professors and classes. I really love the idea of reaching out to professors at local colleges and universities. There's a lot of them these days working in this area of problem gambling. And where this can be a great partnership is that they oftentimes are looking for data. They're looking for ways to advance research, to advance practice. So sometimes they can be a great resource and do a lot of that evaluation design for you and help you also collect data. It's also really important to think about leadership support for evaluation. That's a key component. It can often get overlooked. Sometimes the difference between being able to do a large evaluation or a very small one is what your leadership uh, sees, and how they see the value in this. Oftentimes we're leading from a middle point where we have folks outside the organization we're reporting to, folks in our organization. So the more that we can bring everyone together and talk about why this is important, the better. We've talked right now about kind of the what, we've talked about the who, and now we're going to shift a little bit into the how. Um, your next step is really going to be to decide on the type of evaluation you want to conduct. We're going to briefly talk through each of these, but just keep in mind that you often are going to have multiple types of evaluation going on at once, and you may not know the specific names for that, and that's not a problem. But I wanted to make sure that we talk through these types because these are things that you can put in grant applications, you can talk to your funders about. They're terms that will likely resonate with them. First we're going to talk about is called process evaluation, and that's really where you are working to implement a program, a strategy, a campaign, and you're really focusing on that implementation process. You're looking at things like the outputs of what was implemented, by whom, where, and with what priority population in mind. How many sessions were implemented of a training or a curriculum? How many times and how many different media did the campaign run on? When you're doing a process evaluation, you can also do something called a fidelity assessment. And that's really just asking the question, you know, did the implementation follow the plan? Did it follow the logic model? And there are lots of times where it may not, in part because as we're working on something, we might need to course correct in the middle. We might have things come up that we couldn't have anticipated that we have to adapt from. This process evaluation is something that you're probably going to do within your team, and it's really going to help you with program improvement. Related but a little bit different is something called formative evaluation, and this is something that oftentimes we're going to do early in the life cycle of a campaign, a program, a strategy. It can be ongoing, but really what we're looking at here is, you know, our with what we're seeing as we're implementing. Do we think the goals of the program are likely to be fulfilled? Are we seeing barriers? Are there things that are making implementation go easier than it otherwise would? We can look at things like what our participants or the people engaging with our campaigns think about, the quality, the relevance, and the utility to their lives and to their work. We can get feedback and satisfaction data as well. And really what a formative evaluation does is it focuses on quality or continuous quality improvement. We're getting information about the people we're working with, their experience with what we're doing, and then using that to go back to our team and really talk about how we can improve our efforts, better focus, better meet the needs of the population we're trying to support. All of that feeds into there. We also, kind of moving through, most of the time we're also needing to do some sort of outcome evaluation. Did we see change? Um, did we reach our outcomes? And when we get here, we're going to circle back to our logic model. And by and large, what we need to measure should track that logic model. An outcome evaluation is probably oftentimes is going to use some simpler designs, and we'll talk about these here in a couple of minutes. But things like maybe a pre-test or a post-test. It might look at measures of reach if for a media campaign, or if we're able to reach those folks and pull some of them into a focus group, getting a sense of how that campaign changed their behavior. Or maybe we can do a survey. Or maybe if we're working with college students, the college or university we're working with collects some data as part of some ongoing student assessment that we can use to look at changes over time. Um, our outcome evaluation is going to depend on how much we have in terms of time and resources. If we have a 1-year grant, our time frames are short, and that's going to mean that this part has to be really simple. We're going to have to focus on things like, did we change knowledge? How many folks are aware of our campaign? Um, Basic things like that. As we get larger grants and larger funding sources that have more time resources and more funding resources, we can go more in depth. With those, maybe we're going to do focus groups and surveys. Maybe we're going to do some really involved analytics so that we know more about what's going on and what changed. The one thing here, an outcome evaluation is a great thing. It really can't tell us. We might see change. We might see changes in knowledge. We might see changes in awareness. We might see changes in our risk and protective factors, perceptions of harms, perception of harm, intentions to gamble, things like that. But it's really hard for us to then know how much of those changes came from what we're doing or things that came from, other things that might be going on in the context around us. It can be things like, um, is there are there changes in legislation going on at the same time? An outcome evaluation sometimes will have a hard time figuring that out. When we get to impact evaluation, a couple of things here. Um, it may seem like this has a similar focus to outcome evaluation, because it is also asking, did we see the changes from the program, strategy, campaign, or intervention that we wanted to see in our logic model? But what's different here is that it's going to use a different design. And again, we're going to talk more about those designs here in a minute. But it's going to take a much more rigorous design where we might have an experimental design where we're randomly assigning people to get what we're doing or not. We might look at comparison groups so that we can see what happens for folks that don't participate. We might look at record data. A lot of times this is going to be done with external teams. And, you know, what's important here is that it requires, I think, to some extent, the most financial and human capital and program capacity. Uh, I'm going to stop for a second and just we have a question um, in the Q&A about differentiating between outputs and outcomes. So let me stop for a second and talk about that. Um, the big difference between an output is in an outcome is an output is tied to what we're doing. We delivered 6 sessions of a curriculum. We distributed 1,400 surveys. We ran a campaign in 7 communities. We paid for 9 billboards. We conducted 3 focus groups. Our outputs typically are they're focused on sort of what we've been doing. Our outcomes from that are really what changed. So we put up billboards. We put up 7 billboards. That's the output. The outcome would be um, that people in our community know where to turn or know where to call if they need support for a gambling problem. We did 7 sessions of a curriculum with high school students. That's our output. Our outcome would be that they know more about a variety of different types of harm. They have more knowledge about healthy choices, things like that. I hope that helps. That's a great question. The other thing that I think I wanted to just talk about is called developmental evaluation. To some extent, this is a newer form of evaluation. It really didn't come about or really wasn't thought about until the mid 2010s. But this is probably something that's pretty common, and it's pretty common if we're innovating. And what this means is that evaluators are part of your program team. They're working with you as you're developing the program or strategy. And at the same time, they're developing and helping to design and implement the evaluation. Um, this is a really common approach because sometimes you know, we're developing new things. There are fewer evidence-based programs, practices, and strategies related to problem gambling prevention than there are for other types of problems. So a lot of times we are innovating with new things that haven't been developed before. And so basically building in our evaluator as part of our program development team helps make sure that helps us with our logic model and that logic chain. And it also helps make sure that as we're moving forward, we've got our continuous quality improvement. Um, and really what this says is that it acknowledges that so much of what we do is new and innovative, that we may not have something fixed yet to evaluate. Within developmental evaluation, you'll see a process evaluation, you'll see an outcome evaluation, you'll see a formative evaluation going in there. This is more just a different philosophy that um, in this case, evaluators don't need to be separate from the program. They can be part of the program and still do their job and do it well and help us tell that story. We talked a little bit about some research designs and going to talk quickly about those. I think the first thing would be you may come up with a formal design and think about it as a design. This may just be something though that you do and you don't actually call it as a design, and that's okay. Um, the simplest is going to be a pre-test and post-test. We see this a lot if we're doing a curriculum or a training. We do a survey before something happens. We do a survey after something happens. Maybe we do a follow-up survey too. It's just really with the folks who are being impacted. We may, if we want to know a little bit more about what's going on, do those surveys, but then also the same survey with folks who aren't who aren't receiving the intervention, who aren't seeing the campaign, who aren't part of the training. These are probably pretty common in both of these in problem gambling prevention initiatives. Um, we see less often like an experimental design where we might randomly assign someone to be part of a training or not, to randomly assign someone to receive an intervention or not. Um, by and large, in the gambling space, the resources are much more limited to do something like that. We see that sometimes with our university partners, we'll have resources to do it. Some of our more well-funded things can do it. But if we're in the community, we're probably going to end up doing a pre-post or maybe a pre-post with a comparison group. The more complex your design, probably the more resources you're going to need. Let's talk for and another question has come up. Should pre-test questions match post-test questions? That's a great question. By and large, your pre-test questions should match your post-test questions if you're measuring things like knowledge or attitudes. You want to make sure that you're asking about the same thing at both points. But at the same time, your post-test may have additional questions. It may ask about the experience someone had interacting with a campaign or being part of a training. So I think the answer is for some of those outcomes, absolutely. The questions you are going to want to have match, but on the post test, you can ask different things that really give you a better sense of what that experience was and how it made a difference. So let's talk for a minute about measurement. You're going to do with measurement, there's lots of different things you can measure. You can measure the characteristics of those you reach, the numbers that you reach, their characteristics. You can measure your key outcomes, and link those to your evaluation questions. And that's probably going to come from your logic model. It also may come from programmer strategy materials if you're using an evidence-based practice or a curriculum. And you can also, as you're developing your program, think about other things that you might want to know or that your stakeholders might want to know about. You know, if you're measuring something like awareness of a media campaign, awareness of a strategy, you may also want to measure peer norms or perceptions of risk. Some of the other things you can measure are behaviors. How often someone's doing something, their attitudes. Do they think it's risky or not risky? Um, do they think it's recreation? Do they think it's something else? Their knowledge. You can actually be creative about what you measure. Your partnerships here become important. If you've got a university partner, if you have outside folks, if you have people on your teams or in your organization that have done measurement before, they can help you develop those measures. Couple of, I guess, considerations just to think about here. What you measure is going to depend on your logic model, what you need to talk about, your program intervention campaign or strategy, and the requirements. Sometimes your funder tells you what to measure. And that how to measure. You're going to look at measures and questions that you've used previously. You might look at previous evaluations. That's a great way to look at what other people have done and basically use that as a guide to design your evaluation as well. Universities in your university extension services oftentimes have great resources out there for measurement, question types and scales and things like that you can reach with a simple a simple Google search. My recommendation would be, or often is, that a lot of the time it is better to measure a few things really well than it is to try to measure everything possible. So really think about what's most important for you to know. So we think about how to collect data. There's lots of different ways, and we need to tailor that to what we're doing. We might do surveys, we might do interviews, we might do focus groups. Um, we also may have program records. We might have data sources. We might have partners that have data, like in a university. If we're doing a media campaign, our media partner might be able to measure reach. If we're doing a social media campaign, we can do things like click-through rates from Facebook ads. Sometimes we can get some demographics too, depending on what social media platform is being used, about who's seeing our ads or who's seeing our campaign. As you think about this, it's really important to sort of identify your tools and then create a plan. You know, what you think you want to use, when you're going to collect it, or when you're going to obtain the records, and who's going to help you. Are you getting it from participants? Are you getting it from partners? All of that will help you know how to invest the time of your team and really the time of your partners um, with collecting data. One of the things we wanted to put together here are just some common, types of problem gambling, grant-funded activities, and some of the evaluation tools that often get used. Presentations, you can do surveys, you can do focus groups or listening sessions. You can do that with workshops and all of that. A lot of times we might be doing a train the trainer, and we want to know what those impacts are. We can look at things because there we're working with professionals or folks working in the field. What they thought, how the quality was, how relevant they thought it was. Is it useful for them? How are they going to use it in their practice, and how is it going to change their practice? We talked a little bit about social media metrics. We can also go in, depending on what the social media campaign looks like, and look at social media comments and code those. We can pull folks together and do focus or discussion groups and see sort of what reactions and responses were to those campaigns. Um, Sometimes we do websites, to help get information out there. There we can pre-test that website. We can get metrics about who's accessing it and where they're going, and that tells us a lot about how it's being used. We might be tabling or offering resources, that information dissemination strategy. And there we can look at surveys, conversations, QR code based data collection, the number and types of resources we're getting out there. And again, just think about your partners. If you're a lottery and you're doing a statewide media campaign, it's probably decently well funded, and you've got a media partner. And as part of that, they'll know how to pull metrics and help you get a sense of what that reach is. You may need to go beyond that, but it's a good start. Analysis and reporting. I think this would be one of the things that can be hardest to think about for those of us who are not statisticians. The big questions that can certainly keep me up at night. How am I going to analyze the data I'm collecting? Um, who's going to create the report? Um, what do I need to do to meet my reporting requirements to the funder? And then some easier questions too. Do you need a full report or a one-page infographic? And how will you use your findings? Is it program improvement? Is it your grant reporting? Is it for new applications? Is it to tell the story of how you're impacting the community? Actually, I'm going to go back to that slide because there's one other thing I want to say here is that this is also a great place where a partner can help you if you don't have this capacity in-house, or if it's a place that you've not been trained to do. There's so much interest with our college and university populations in the area of problem gambling right now. that it's a place where what they can bring to the table is the specialized training and expertise. And what you can bring to the table is an opportunity for them to analyze data and understand more about what's going on in their community or in a state or in a different context. The final thing I want to encourage all of us to think more about is how we tell a story. We started this webinar talking about a logic model. If we do this, then this will happen. If this happens, then this will happen. We can report those data as numbers. 85% of our participants gained knowledge about um, harms from underage gambling. But another way that we can look at this is we can think about how to tell a story. What was the experience of the people who participated in our program strategy or media campaign? Um, what was our process as a team in developing this? What did we learn through this? What are our reflections as a team based on what we see for outcomes, what we're hearing from participants, and from our efforts to improve our efforts as we're going along? And we can do this at multiple levels. We can talk through with our participants, our team, and our stakeholders, and have them share their experiences and feedback. We can pull together that feedback along with any quantitative numbers that we have. We can look at visuals. The cliche is, that a picture is worth 1,000 words. But talking about this experience of implementing something, marrying it with our outcomes, marrying it with our learnings, and then a picture of what happened tells the story in a really powerful way. Um, what's important here to think about also is that our ethics are key. We want to make sure that we have consent from participants if we're going to quote them. They might want their comments to be confidential, and so we just want to make sure that going forward we have that. We have those processes in place, and we also want to make sure that when we're talking with participants, that we are really doing a good job of sharing their feedback and their stories. I love this quote at the bottom. By weaving data into compelling narratives, program evaluations become more engaging, memorable, and persuasive, making stakeholders more likely to act on the findings. The reason I want to probably have this be one of our calls to action is that when we evaluate, we're talking about what happened. When we build it into a story, we're telling our communities, our stakeholders, and our funders why we need them to stay at the table and why there's more to do and the promise of what we can do going forward. One of the best things about working with NCPG is that there are no wrong doors. Um, as you move forward, if you have questions, I'd encourage you, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. My email is up here on the slide. We'll make sure we get that out after the webinar. And I think also that you can absolutely reach out to anyone at NCPG to ask questions or to look for help uh, about specific different types of questions you may have as you're working in your communities. Going to quickly just share some of the resources that we've got. The slide deck has some great links to logic model templates and resources. As you're thinking about evaluation and program development, the Community Toolbox from the University of Kansas is a great resource. evaluation is covered in chapters 36 to 39, and then there's a toolkit in chapter 12. They have just made that ADA accessible, so there's fewer templates to download, and most of everything is now on the screen, but that content is still there. And it's one of the places I go to when I have a question about how to do something. We promised also that we'd give you a link to the WK Kellogg Evaluation Handbook. I also like to share out the Better Evaluation Framework as well, and that's linked here as well. And then finally, three great resources for storytelling and evaluation. Everything from how that storytelling leads to deeper impact, and then also how to really collect and utilize personal stories. I'm going to stop the share. Actually, it looks like the previous slide. Let me go back. I think that's two. All right, let me get the chat open. Right. What we will work to do here is to try to get those links here in the chat. What I'd also like to do, though, is just open it up to see if you all have any questions that we can. I forgot to swap the display. Thank you for letting me know, team, that I had the wrong screen showing. What I'd like to do is just ask if there are any questions that I can answer or that we can help with.
Dr. Karshawar, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. I know something that has often come up in my conversations with community organizations that I work with through the Agility Grants program have been around collecting demographic information and some of the sensitivities around collecting information on age, gender, race, ethnicity, and then things, questions that are more related to subject matter like experience with gambling and things like that. Do you have any suggestions or thoughts you can share around collecting those kinds of sensitive information?
Yeah, that is a great question, a great thing to think about. In the context that we are in, and depending on what the work that you're doing, it may not be possible to collect detailed demographic data. And if you are able to collect demographic data, there may be indicators that, such as race, gender, sex, that you don't necessarily want to collect in order to make sure that the people you're working with, that their confidentiality and or their anonymity is maintained. So I would say there's two considerations there. The first is, depending on what you're doing, it may not be possible to do that, to just collect those indicators. I would say to do the best that you can, um, but also realize that it's just some things may not be a good fit to go ahead and collect. Um, Related to experience, that is a sensitive type of indicator, in part because we have age groups and groups of folks who should not be engaging in gambling, those who are underage and things like that. Sometimes that can be really helpful to have, but if you're collecting those types of sensitive indicators, no, I would say to focus on two things. The first is that people may not want to report that. And if you're doing something like a focus group, they may not, that may be something that's not a great thing to ask about, simply because other folks in that focus group will then sort of know that answer, even if they don't know who the person is. Um, so folks may not answer honestly, so the data you get might underrepresent things. Um, I think it does become a case by case sort of challenge to think through. And I don't think there's one right or wrong answer there.
Thank you. That's very helpful.